Chapter 9. Sorry. Oops. Okay. That winter, all Annie had to do was walk in a room or appear at a bus stop or a corner where we were meeting, and I didn't even have to think about smiling. I could feel my face smiling all on its own. We saw each other every afternoon that we could, and on weekends we called each other just about every night, and even that didn't seem enough. Sometimes we even arranged to call each other from payphones at lunch times. It was a good thing I'd never had much trouble with school time because I floated through classes, writing letters to Annie or daydreaming. The fundraising campaign went on around me without my paying much attention to it. I did pledge some money. I listened to Sally and Walt make speeches. I even helped them collect pledges from some of the other kids. But I was never really there, because Annie filled my mind. Songs I heard on the radio suddenly seemed to fit Annie and me. Poems I read seemed written especially for us. We began sending each other poems that we liked. I would have gone broke buying Annie plants if I hadn't known how much it bothered her that I often had money and she usually didn't. We kept finding new things in New York to show each other. It was as if we were both seeing the city for the first time. One afternoon, I suddenly noticed and then showed Annie how the sunlight dripped over the ugly face of her building, softening it and making it glow, almost as if there was a mysterious light source hidden inside its drab walls. And Annie showed me how ailanthus trees, whatever, grow under subway and sewer gratings, stretching toward the sun, making shelter in the summer, she said, laughing for the small dragons that live under the streets. Much of that winter was magical. Magical was the only word, again. And a big part of that magic was that no matter how much of ourselves we found to give to each other, there was always more we wanted to give. One Saturday in early December, we got our parents to agree to let us go out to dinner together. "Why shouldn't we?" Annie said to me. It was her idea. People go out to dinner on dates and stuff, don't they? She grinned and said formally, "Liza Winthorpe, I'd like to make a date with you for dinner. I know this great Italian restaurant." It was a great Italian restaurant. It was in the West Village and tiny, with no more than 10 or 12 tables, and the ones along the walls where we sat were separated by iron scroll work partitions, so we had the illusion of privacy, if not privacy itself. It was dark too. Our main light came came from a candle in a Chianti bottle, Chianti bottle, Chianti bottle, Anti. Annie's face looked golden and soft, like the face of a woman in a Renaissance painting. "What's this?" I asked, pointing to a long name on the menu and trying to resist the urge to touch Annie's lovely face. Scapoloni al Marsala? Al Marsala? Annie's laugh was as warm as the candlelight. No, she corrected. Scapoline alla Marsala. Scapoline alla Marsala, I repeated. What is it? It's real? No, it's veal, she said. Vitello, sort of like thin veal cutlets in a wonderful sauce. Is it good? I asked, but I was still thinking of the way she'd said I don't know if it's vitello or vitello, because I don't speak Italian. Vitello, with a musical pause between the L's. Annie laughed again and kissed the closed fingers of her right hand. Then she popped her finger open and tossed her hand up in a cliché but airy gesture that came straight out of a movie about Venice. About Venice we'd seen the week before. Is it good? She said. Nana makes it. So we both had scalpoline alla marsala after antipasto, and along with a very illegal half bottle of wine. And then Annie convinced me to try a wonderful pastry called cannoli. Oh, cannolis are good. Yay. And after that, we had espresso. And still we sat there with no one asking about us leaving. We stayed so late that both my parents and Annie's were furious when we got home. You never call any more, Liza, my father said, muttering something about wishing I'd never seen other people besides Annie. No, muttering something about wishing I'd see other people. Yeah. I don't want to set a curfew, he said, but 2 girls wandering around New York at night, it just isn't safe. Dad was right. But time with Annie was real time, stopped. And more often, we both forgot to call. Chad kept kidding me that I was in love, and asking with whom, and then Sally and Walt did too, and after a while I didn't even mind, because even if they had the wrong idea about it, they were right. Soon it wasn't hard anymore to say it, to myself, I mean, as well as over and over again to Annie, and to accept her saying it to me. We touched each other more easily, just kissed, or held hands, or hugging each other, though nothing more than that. We didn't really talk much about being gay. Most of the time we just talked about ourselves. We were what seemed important then, not some label. The day that the first snow fell was a Saturday, and Annie and I called each other up at exactly the same moment over and over again, tying up our phones with busy signals for 10 minutes. I don't remember which of us got through first, But around an hour later, we were both running through Central Park like a couple of maniacs, making snow angels and pelting each other with snowballs. We even built a fort and helped. We even built a fort with the help of 3 little boys and their big brother, who was our age. And after that, we all brought a chestnuts and pretzels and sat on a bench eating them till the boys had to go home. Some of the chestnuts were rotten. I remember that because Annie said throwing one away. It's the first sign of a dying city. Rotten chestnuts. I could even laugh at that, along with the boys, because I knew that ugly things about New York weren't boring her so much anymore. Annie and I went ice skating a few times, and we tried to get our parents to let us go to Vermont to ski, but they wouldn't. Mr. Kenyon took us and Nana and Nanny's mother out to Westchester in his cab just before Christmas to look at the lights on people's houses, and they all wished me Buon Natale when they dropped me off at home. On Christmas afternoon, I gave Annie a ring. "Oh, Liza, she said, groping in the pocket of her coat. We were on the promenade, and it had just begun to snow. Look! Out of her pocket, she took a little box the same size as the little box I'd just handed her. I looked around for people and then kissed the end of her nose. It was almost dark, and besides, I didn't really care if anyone saw us. Is the silly grin on my face? I asked her. As silly as the silly grin on your face? Jerk, she said. Open your present. You first. I can't. My hands are shaking. You know what happens to me. You know what happens to my gloves if I take them off. What happens to your gloves if you take them off? What happens to your gloves when you take them off is you lose them. But you don't lose them if you give them to me. I held out my hand. I'll hold your gloves, Annie. No, I'll hold your gloves, Unicorn. Okay? Okay, she said, and stripped them off and fumbled with the metallic ribbon on the box. With a wonderful clumsiness that I had never seen anyone else as graceful as Annie have. Oh, for God's sake, I said. I'll bite it off if it's stuck. You will not. It's my first Christmas present from you, and I'm going to keep every scrap of it. Forever. Ribbon and all. Oh, Liza. By then, she had the box open and was staring down at the little golden ring with the pale blue stone that I'd found in an antique shop on Atlantic Avenue at the edge of Brooklyn Heights. Liza, she said, looking at me. No staring. With wonder. I don't believe this. She nodded toward the box I was holding. Open yours. I gave Annie back her gloves and stuffed my own into my pockets. And I opened the box she'd handed me and found a gold ring with a pale green stone. No, not identical to the ring I'd given her, but almost. I don't believe it either, I said, but I also do. It's some kind of sign. Come on. It is Come on. It is Liza. You know it is. The occult sciences, I said, intentionally pompous, are the only ones that would attempt to explain this kind of coincidence. And the occult sciences are not. Annie flung her arms around my neck and kissed me, even though there were 4 kids galloping down the snow path from Clark Street to the promenade, showering each other with snowballs. If you don't put that ring on this moment, I'm going to take it back, Annie whispered in my ear. Occult sciences indeed. She leaned back, looking at me, her hands still on my shoulders, her eyes shining softly at me, and snow falling, melting on her nose. Beyond Natali, she whispered, Amore mio. Merry Christmas, my love, I answered. My parents and Chad and I went up to Annie's school to hear her recital, which had been postponed till right after Christmas because of snow. Annie said many times that the only, decent teacher in the whole school was her music teacher, and the only department, even counting, physical and only counting phys ed, that tried to do anything that extracurricular activities was the music department. As soon as I heard Annie singing that night, I could see why a music department would give recitals as long as Annie was around to be in them. Hearing Annie sing in the recital was nothing like hearing her sing in the museum that first day, or hearing her hum around her apartment or mine, or on the street the way I had a few times since then. I knew she had a lovely voice, and I knew from the time in the museum that she could put a lot of feeling behind what she sang. But this was more than all of those things combined. The other kids in the recital were good, but maybe the way I'd expected Annie to be. But right before Annie sang, she looked at the audience as if to say, listen, there's this really beautiful song I'd like you to hear. As if she wanted to make the audience still a present of it. The audience seemed to know something unusual was coming. For when Annie looked at them, they settled back, calm and happy and expectant. And when she started singing, you couldn't even hear anyone breathe. I glanced at Chad and Mom and Dad to see if maybe it was my loving Annie that made me think she was so good, but I could see from their faces, and from the faces of the other people, not just her family, who looked about ready to burst with pride, that everyone else thought she was just as good as I did. I'm not sure how to describe Annie's voice, or if anyone really could, except maybe a music critic. It's a low soprano. Mezzo-soprano is its technical name, and it's a little husky, not gravelly husky, but rich, and according to my mother, it's 100% on pitch all the time. It's also almost perfectly in control when Annie wants to fill a room with her voice. She can. But she can also make she can also make it as soft as a whisper. A whisper you can always hear. But none of that was what made the audience sit there, not moving every time Annie sang. It was the feeling again, the same thing that first drew me to Annie in the museum, only much, much more so. Annie's singing was so spontaneous, and she gave so much of herself that it sounded as if she'd actually written each song, or was making each one up as she went along, the way she'd done in the museum. When she sang something sad, I wanted to cry. When she sang something happy, I felt myself smiling. Dad said he felt the same, and Mom had a long, serious talk with Annie the next afternoon about becoming a professional. But Annie said she wasn't sure yet if she wanted to, although she knew she wanted to major in musical. She wanted to continue in she wanted to major in music and continue singing, no matter what else she did. Chad, even though he was shy with girls, gave her a big hug after the performance and said, "There's nothing to say, Annie. You were so good." I couldn't think of anything to say either. Mostly, I just wanted to put my arms around her. But at the same time, I felt in awe of her. This was a whole new Annie, an Annie I hardly knew. I don't remember what I did or said. Squeezed her hand, I think. Said something lame, but she said later that she didn't care what anyone thought except me. I had the flu that winter, badly. Sometime late in January, I think it was. The night before I was fine, but the next morning I woke up with my throat on fire and my head feeling as if a team of... Let's see if I can get this word. Clydesdales were galloping through it. Mom made me go back to bed and came in every couple of hours with something for me to drink. I think the only reason I remember the doctor's making one of his house calls is because I nearly choked on the pills that Mom gave me to take after he left. Sometime, that first afternoon though, I heard voices outside my door. Mom had let Chad wave to me from the threshold earlier, but it was too early for Dad to be home, so I knew it couldn't be either of them. And then Annie was beside me with Mom protesting from the door. "It's okay, Mrs. Winthorpe," she was saying. "I had the flu this year already." "Liar," I whispered when Mom finally left. "Last year this year," said Annie, turning the cloth on my head to its colder side. "It's all the same." She put her hand on my cheek. "You must feel rotten." "Not so much rotten," I said, as not here. As if I were floating very far away. "I didn't want to be far away from you," I said, reaching for her hand. "But I am. I really must have been pretty sick, because I could barely concentrate, even on Annie." Annie held my hand, stroking it softly. "Don't talk," she said. "I won't let you float away. You can go far with me holding on to you, but I'll keep you here, love. Shh." She began to sing very softly and sweetly, and although I was still floating, I was riding on clouds now, with Annie's voice in her hand, gently anchoring me to earth. We didn't allow Sorry, we didn't always use words when we were together. We didn't need to. That was uncanny. But maybe the best thing of all, although I don't think we were about it much. I don't think we thought about it much. It just happened. There's a Greek legend. No, it's in something Plato wrote about how true lovers are really two halves of the same person. It says that people wander around searching for their other half, and when they find him or her, they are finally whole and perfect. The thing that gets me is that the story says that originally all people were really pairs of people joined back to back, and that some of the pairs were man and man, some women and woman, and others man and woman. What happened was that all of these double people went to war with the gods, and the gods, to punish them, split them all in two. That's why some lovers are heterosexual, and some are homosexual, female and female, or male and male. I love that story when I first heard it. In junior year, I think it was, because it seemed fair and right and sensible. But that winter, I really began to believe it was true. Because the first time Annie and I learned about each other, the more I felt she was the other half of me. The oddest thing, perhaps, was that even as the winter went on, we still didn't touch each other much more than we had at the beginning, after around Christmas, I mean. But we did realize more and more that winter that we wanted to. I especially realized it, I guess, since it was so new to me. And the more we realized it, the more we tried to avoid it. No, the more I did, at least, at first. We were in Annie's room. Her parents were out. And Nana was asleep. We were listening to an opera on the radio, and we were sitting on the floor. My head was in Annie's lap, and her hand was on my hair, moving softly to my throat, then to my breast, and I sat up and reached for the radio, fiddling with the dial, saying something dumb like, "The volume's fading," which it wasn't. We were in my kitchen. My parents and Chad were in the living room watching TV. Annie had stayed for dinner, and we were doing some dishes. I put my arms around her from behind and held her body so close to mine that I wasn't sure whose pulse I felt throbbing. But when she turned to me, I reached quickly for the dish towel and a plate. Then it began happening the other way around, too. Annie began moving away from me. I remember one time in the subway, it was pretty late, and for a minute there was no one in the car with us. So I leaned over and kissed Annie, and she stiffened, holding herself away from me, rigid. The worst thing was that we were too shy to talk about it, and we got so tangled up that we began misunderstanding each other more and more often, just in general, and the wordless communication we prized ourselves on so much weakened, and we began to fight about dumb things, like what time we were going to meet and what we were going to do, or whether Annie was coming to my apartment or I was going to hers, or if I should take the subway or the bus. The worst fight was that March. We'd gone to the museum, the Metropolitan, and Annie seemed to want to stay in front of the medieval choir screen forever. And I wanted to go to the Temple of Dender? There's nothing to look at, I said nastily. She was just staring. At least that's what it looked like to me. You must have memorized every... Curlicue by now. Really, how many of those post things are there? I pointed to one of the hundreds of vertical shafts of which the screen is made. Annie turned to me, blazing. I'd never seen her so angry. Look, why don't you just go to your silly temple if you wanted to so much? Some people can pray better in the dark. That's all. No, sorry. But you probably don't pray at all. You're so pure and sure of everything. A guard glanced in our direction as if he was trying to decide whether to tell us to be quiet. We weren't talking loud yet, but we were getting there. I was mad enough to ignore most of what Annie said till later. I just turned and walked away, past the guard to the temple. I must have stayed there for a good half hour until it hit me that I'd said the first rotten thing. But when I walked back to the choir screen, ready to apologize, Annie was gone. Did Annie call? Did Annie call? I said casually when I got home around 6:30. No, Mom said, giving me an odd look. I don't think I said a word during dinner, and all evening I jumped every time the phone rang. Liza had a fight, Chad sang gleefully. The third time I ran to the phone and had to turn it over to someone else, usually him. Sorry. Lies? Betcha you and Annie fought over some boy, huh? Or... That will do, Chad, Mom said, looking at me. Haven't you got homework? If he hasn't, I have, I said, and fled to my room, slamming the door. At about 10 o'clock, Chad was in the shower. I called Annie, but Nana said she'd gone to bed. Could you see if she's still awake? I asked, humbly. There was a pause, and then Nana said, Liz, you had a fight with Annie, no? Yes, I admitted. I could almost hear her head nodding. I guess that when I see seen her come in, she look all fussed. Maybe you call tomorrow, eh? It's none of my business, but sometimes people just need a little time. I knew she was right, but I couldn't let it go. I didn't want to go to sleep thinking Annie was mad at me, or that I'd hurt her in some unforgivable way. Could you just tell her I'm sorry? I said. Sure. Nana sounded relieved. I tell her. But you hang up now. Call tomorrow, okay? Okay, I said, hanging up. Mom's hand was on my shoulder the moment I put down the receiver. "Liza," she began. "Liza, couldn't we talk about this? No, shouldn't we talk about this? You seem so upset, honey. What?" But I wrenched away and ran up to my room, where I read until dawn, mostly Shakespeare's sonnets, and cried over the names I had once copied out and sent to Annie. The next afternoon I ran most of the way home from school, so I'd get there before Chad. I knew Mom had a meeting, and I wanted to be sure I was alone when I called Annie. But Annie was waiting outside my building, sitting on the steps, in a heavy red and black lumber jacket I'd never seen before. I was so surprised to see her. I stopped and stood there, but she got up right away and came toward me, her arms woodenly at her sides. The lumber jacket was so big, it looked as though it belonged to someone else. Want to go for a walk?" she asked. She looked haggard, as if she hadn't slept any more than I had. I nodded, and we walked silently toward the promenade. I kept twisting Annie's ring with the thumb and little finger of the hand it was on, wondering if she was going to want it back. Annie leaned against the railing and seemed to be trying to follow the progress of the Staten Island ferry through the fog. "Annie," I began finally. She turned, leaning her back against the railing. Nana told me you called and said that you were sorry," she said. "Accepted. But, I said, my heart racing. She hadn't smiled yet, and I knew I hadn't either. "But," said Annie, turning back to face the arbor, soft hair blowing around her face. "Liza, we're like the temple and the choir screen, as I thought the day I met you. Only then I was just guessing. You really are like the temple. Light. You go happily on without really noticing, and I'm dark, like the choir screen, like the room it's in. I feel too much and want too much, I guess." And she turned to face me again. Her eyes were desolate. "I want to be in the real world with you, Liza. For you, but we're still running away. Or you are. Or, Liza, I don't want to be afraid for this, of the physical part of loving you. But you're making me afraid and guilty because you seem to think it's wrong or dirty or something. Maybe you did all along. I don't know." "No," I interrupted loudly, unable to keep still any longer. "No, not dirty, Annie. I don't want to make you afraid," I finished lamely. For a minute, Annie seemed to be waiting for me to say something else, but I couldn't just then. I really was praying. "There in the museum," she said softly, "when you got so mad, I was praying that I could ignore it if you wanted me to. Not the love, but the physical part of it. But having to do that, I think that makes me more afraid than facing it would." It came crashing through my foggy mind. that in spite of everything Annie had just said, I wanted desperately to touch her, to hold her, and then I was able to speak again. No, it came crashing through my foggy mind that in spite of everything, Annie had just said, I wanted desperately to touch her, to hold her, and then I was able to speak again. It's not true, I said carefully, that I want to ignore it. And I'm not going on happily without noticing. I stopped, feeling Annie take my hand, and realized my fists were clenched. It scares me too, Annie, I managed to say, but not because I think it's wrong or anything. At least, I don't think it's that. It's mostly because it's that strong, the love and the friendship and every part of it. I think that was when I finally realized that, as I said it. But you always move away, she said. You do too. I know. Then we both looked out at the arbor. Then we both looked out at the arbor again, as if we'd just met and were shy with each other again. But at least after that, we were able to begin talking about it. It's timing, partly. It's as if we never want the same thing at the same time, I said. We were sitting on the sofa in my parents' living room. My parents and Chad were out. We didn't know for how long. I don't think so, said Annie. It's the one thing we don't know about each other, the one thing we aren't letting each other know, as if we're blocking the channels because we're so scared of it, Liza. The real question is why, still is why. She reached for my hand. I wish we could just sort of let what happens happen, she said, without thinking so much about it. Her thumb was moving gently on my hand. Her eyes had a special soft look in them I've never seen in anyone's but Annie's, and only in Annie's when she looked at me. I'll promise to try not to move away next time, she said. I'll promise to, I said, my mouth so dry the words scraped. Right now, I don't think I could stop anything from happening that started. But a few minutes later, my father's keys turned in the lock and we both jumped guiltily away from each other. And that was when there began to be that problem too. There was really no place we could be alone. Of course, there were times when no one was home, at Annie's apartment or mine, but we were always afraid that someone would walk in. And it wasn't long before we began using that fear to mask our deeper one. We were still restrained and hesitant with each other. But maybe, and I think this is true, maybe we also just needed more time.